Okay, okay, hi everyone. It's been a while since I put a video up. Uh, I've been sick the last couple days. I'm still a little kind of hear it in my voice, but I had a little time right now, so I just wanted to get this video finally done. Because I've been working on it for far too long. I usually don't work very long on getting these videos up. It tends to be more spontaneous. But I got a question about people ask me about the Human Hex, which is a new NIRS device. It looks pretty cool. I got one, and so I've been doing some testing with it, and so I thought I'd put a video up talking about the Moxie and the Human Hex as NIRS devices, and I added another NIRS device, the Portamon, which is a more expensive NIRS device. And I want to look at some differences that devices have and some similarities to help clarify some questions with NIRS, especially quality of NIRS. I one of the reasons this took so long was because I had some conflicting results. That doesn't sound right. I had some problems repeating measurements that I got from the Human. I got some weird results, and then I didn't get them again. And in the end, what I'm displaying now are the results from the Human that I got most consistently. I sent some emails to the Human guys to try to figure out some of the things, so I'm still going to try to communicate with them. So this isn't about those inconsistencies on the Human. One thing that the Human does a little bit different than the other two NIRS devices that I'll show is it does a calibration, which seems like a good thing to do. My issue with that is that you guys, if you own a Human, you can play around with this, calibrate on different areas and do different things, and it'll change the value you're getting. So the calibration does something that changes how the signal responds. The Human Hex guys wrote me back on that question. It just says it changes the intensity of the LEDs. Okay. Still, I don't know exactly what it's doing apart from that, but I think maybe we'll talk about those things in another video as well, to not make this one too long. But let's get to the kind of the meat of the situation. So what I did was, the first thing that I do when I get NIRS devices, I do complete occlusions. The reason I do complete occlusions is because you get a stabilized state where you should know what happens. So we know what should happen with a NIRS signal in a complete occlusion. So I did the complete occlusion with the Portamon, with the Human, and with the Moxie. And I'm going to compare those data points and kind of see what it looks like. This also goes a little bit into the validation of NIRS, which I'll go into the end, is like how validated is the technology, or are the different devices, which isn't so easy to do, especially when we talk about the actual values and not just the trending. So this is an occlusion with the Moxie on my leg and on my arm. You kind of get this downward trend in both of them. You see you reach some kind of minimum value, and then you get this hyperemia respond back up. This pattern is what you should see in the NIRS device. If you don't have this pattern, this fall, this plateau, and this increase up higher, your NIRS device is probably not measuring correctly. So that's step one. Step two would be in a process called physiological calibration. You set your minimum value at 0 and your maximum value at 100. And you would do this for every person and every measurement. With the Moxie, the idea is that no, we're actually getting a physiological calibration in the scaling that's predetermined. All right, so we should get values that are close to 0. We see that here, kind of 10%, a little bit lower than 10%, and they get values that get up to arterial saturation, so up to closer to around 90%. This 75, 80, 85% range. That's what we look for. That's what we think shows to be a good range and an accurate scaling. Now, we can show what the Human does. So the blues are the Humans, and we have the arm and the leg. First to look at is on the arm. When I did this, I actually said it's not so bad. We get it down 0%. So there's one question is it hits that 0% really fast, and then it just flattens out at 0. And one of the things that makes me think about is, well, what happens below 0? Okay, I've had this happen with the Moxie too, which is something I've discussed with the guys from Moxie as well. But when you see this happen, when you see it hit 0, the question is, well, is it artificially being stopped at 0? And if you could measure negatives, it would go lower. That's one of my concerns. But overall, it doesn't look so bad. You get this range down to 0, you get it to go up to close to 70. The arm doesn't look so bad except for the rapid fall. But then when we look at the leg, you get a completely different pattern. First of all, it takes forever to go down, and I didn't get it to go down below 40. And I did all of these occlusions multiple times. I did about 40 occlusions last week. And so you really don't have this dynamic range or this functional range. Okay. So it makes it much harder to use it. And especially you see the difference between the two. And you have this huge functional range when I do it on my arm, but not when I do it on my leg. I think one of the major contributors to this is how well your NIRS device does with adipose tissue layer. Okay, so especially if you're doing SMO2, so we're doing muscle oxygenation. We're not doing tissue saturation, which we'll get into later. You're doing muscle oxygenation. So your NIRS device tries to get through and model, well, what are the different layers I have to get through before I hit my muscle? And then I want to isolate just that signal from the muscle. If you have trouble doing that and you measure on different sites that have clear different adipose tissue layers, like my quad and my forearm essentially has no fat layer. My quad has more than my forearm. So if your device is sensitive to those adipose tissue layers, it makes total sense that something like this would happen, because all of a sudden you're getting a lot of noise from the adipose tissue, which has blood in it and skin as well. But I think adipose tissue makes the big part of it. As blood in it as well, it's not metabolically active, or not very high metabolically active. So that oxygen just kind of sits there, and it gets included. If you can't isolate that out, if you can't remove that from your measurement, you're going to get much higher values in areas where you have higher fat layers. By the way, this is also true for the Moxie. If I were to measure on someone who has significant adipose tissue layers, you actually get a picture that looks like what the human leg looks like. But as long as it's within the acceptable range of the spacing, you won't get that picture on this type of occlusion. So that's something to be considered. So there's some differences going on there, which leads me, again, the picture looks like it should. If I were to scale the human leg picture, it would look fine, but the functional scale does not look like it should. Okay, all the trending looks perfect, but the scaling I would put into question, especially if we're talking about muscle oxygenation, which that'll clarify a little bit later. Excuse me. Okay, now if we move on and we add the Portamon's a device that actually the percentage, so the percentage value they give, they don't say it's muscle oxygenation. They call it TSI, which is a tissue saturation index. Now, if you call something a tissue saturation index, and you are including you are not differentiating between the layers as much, fat layers and muscle layers, and so that's perfectly fine, because it's a tissue saturation index. It's not a muscle oxygenation index or percent. So what we see here is we actually see that in the arm and in the leg, they look both a little bit more like the human leg picture. Okay, so they kind of don't drop as quickly. They drop. There's some, well, maybe a little bit more difference in the minimal values in the Moxie, but they're much closer together than the human. And then they shoot back up. So overall, their values are both much higher, which is what I would expect from tissue saturation index. Again, the same reasoning is behind why the human leg one's so high. is if you include the other tissue layers, your overall values are just going to be higher. Okay, and it's pretty interesting. Then it also makes sense that the arm is at least somewhat lower than the leg, assuming that there's different tissues, so that they're not going to be the same. Again, also makes sense for a tissue saturation index because they're not the same tissues. So that difference is there, considering what Artin is and Portamon saying is that it's a tissue saturation index. I can rationalize that. Again, you see the exact same trends as all the other NIRS devices, which is what we would expect. So the validation here of all the NIRS devices is, well, they all do the same thing, which is good. That's what they're supposed to do. So on all of these NIRS devices, check, good job. But now if we talk about a functional scale, can I do something not just with my trending information, but the actual values that they're telling me? This is where I get much more skeptical. Okay, in my Moxie response, I get the same response. Doesn't matter if I do my arm or my leg, because I'm just isolating the muscle. So now they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty similar. The question would be, should I get the same response in arm muscle and leg muscles? Because SMO2 is a value that's in relation to what's being measured. Yes, there's going to be difference in let's say the amount of blood available in the occluded leg after you occluded it, myoglobin content, but also oxidative rate of the muscle, muscle fiber types. Those are going to be individually different. But because it's a relative value to those muscles, I see no reason as to why there should be such a big difference between the min values of the two. I see the difference being mostly a product of not being able to differentiate between what is muscle and what is fat, for simplicity's sake, which is what I think the Human has much more trouble with. To that point, also the Portamon more than the Moxie, but not to the same extent. I mean, it's saying it's a tissue saturation index, so I really don't think that it's even trying to isolate those things. Where I think maybe the Human is, that's why it turns out to these discrepancies to be that much bigger. I'm not quite sure on that, but these are the differences that I measured, and I did multiple occlusions with all the devices on arms and legs, and I had like 40 occlusions last week, and this is pretty consistent to what I got. You see the differences. Okay, this video is already pretty long, but I do think it's interesting. I think it's a good thing to get out there from quality of NIRS signals, especially the 0 to 100% scaling, because I think there's something there.